Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in what we hope is the start to a very exciting discussion series on cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. Um, my name is Vinny Taguchi. I have the honor of serving as the president of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. For those who don't know, the JACL is the oldest and largest civil rights organization in America that represents Japanese American, and I believe Asian Americans. And so we're very excited to be talking about this topic because I think it's something that is of interest to a lot of people, and we don't really know where to begin sometimes. Um, so to start, I would like to acknowledge that my uh, this was put together in collaboration by the Twin Cities JCL Social Justice Committee and Yuki Kokubo, our guest here today from Made by Yuki. And this was organized with funding from Les and Karen Suzukamo. So thank you very much to all those who have made this possible. I should have mentioned I use he, him pronouns. And I want to start by welcoming everyone to this event. So we're coming into this space from different places, I think. People have different levels of experience with these topics, different perspectives on it. It affects us in different ways. So that's something we want to be mindful as we go. Of course, we also have folks who are joining us from Japan, folks who are perhaps Japanese Americans joining us from America and other places. We also have some folks who do not have Japanese heritage. We're all going to kind of wrestle with these topics in different ways. As we proceed with this series, each of our speakers will be speaking from their own experiences and perspectives, which means that the views that they express may not be something that we all agree with. At the same time, each speaker may not express the same views. So the speakers may not be in agreement with each other. And we fully expect that, and that's just part of the conversation. So the main thing to keep in mind as an audience member is that we don't expect there to be an absolute line drawn between what is appreciation and what is appropriation. We're going to have that conversation, but we can't draw a final line. So we won't have full closure on this topic, but hopefully we can sort of catalyze the conversations that will help us get there. So with that being said, and without any further ado, I would like to allow Yuki to introduce herself and tell us a bit about who she is and what she does.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vinny, for the introduction to the series and for working with me to put together the series. So my name is Yuki Kokubo, and I run a small clothing company called Made by Yuki. My pronouns are she, her, and I was born in Japan and spent over 30 years in the US, and now I'm back in Japan. And should I just go on about what kind of clothing I make? Is
Yeah,
that okay?
please.
So so Made by Yuki is all clothing that are modern style, and they are created by upcycling like vintage kimonos and yukata fabrics. And my clothing is like purposefully modern so that people can wear them every day in their current wardrobe. And I focus a lot of attention on the textile and history of like kimonos, types of kimonos and types of textiles and motifs like that, so that people can become better educated about what kimonos are.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Oh, excellent. So the outfit you're wearing today, is that one of your works?
Yeah, it is. This is made from a vintage yukata.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
So if you could, Yuki, from the standpoint of, well, I can start by myself. Since we're going to be coming at these topics from different perspectives, I think it's important that we know what our kind of cultural identities are and where we're coming from. So I identify as Japanese Brazilian American. So I'm a first generation immigrant to the US to parents who are born and raised in Brazil. And my Japanese ancestry comes from Japan to Brazil. So I actually don't have any of the World War II incarceration history in my family. But in working with the JACL for the past several years, I've become very familiar with the community history. So Yuki, could you tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Japan in Ibaraki Prefecture, and my parents are originally both from Tokyo, but they migrated here when they were in their early 30s, and I was born in Ibaraki. And when I was 8, my parents and I moved to New York City, and I spent the most of my 30 years in the US in New York, in different parts of New York City. And part of it in Chicago, where I went to college, and a little bit afterwards. And I identify as Asian American or Japanese American because I think even though I was born in Japan, I relate more to the culture of somebody who spent most of their life in the US culturally. It's quite different from being Japanese raised in Japan.
Hmm. So could you elaborate on what that means from your perspective? In what ways do you feel like your experience was shaped as being a Japanese American in New York as opposed to in Japan?
Yeah, I think for me, as it may be similar for a lot of people who identify as Asian American, my Asian identity was really not in the forefront for most of my childhood or young adult life. And it, like a big, let's see, how do I explain this? Something that really changed my perspective was first the 2011 earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disasters in Japan. And I was living in New York at the time, and I had become really disconnected from Japan from a lot of reasons, including like being separated from my parents when I was a teenager. And it really struck me like all of a sudden it came crashing down on me that the country where I was from was like in a lot of trouble, and it really made me realize that like I'm actually Japanese or Japanese American
Hmm.
at that time. And further, I think moving to New York wasn't so easy when I was in third grade. Like I grew up in the country, and then suddenly being like thrust into a very urban and kind of it was pretty dangerous back then. That kind of environment was pretty traumatic, and I think I went to a very mixed elementary school. But throughout my life, I gravitated towards kind of like ignoring my race and culture, and I mostly hung out with white people until probably the 2011 disasters, and I was like, oh my gosh, why have I been living this way? It really became clear to me, and I made like a really big effort to connect with the Japanese community or Japanese American community in New York
Hmm.
City, which now I have very good friends from that community, and it was kind of a revelation for me.
Hmm.
But I think part of my experience of having moved to the US and I faced a lot of like racism was pretty traumatic. And I think that's part of the reason why I was like subconsciously, I couldn't identify as Asian American for a long time.
Hmm.
And then, of course, when Trump got elected, like I think there was a big awakening, in the country and around the world. And I happened to move to Okinawa at the time. And I felt more deeply that I needed to like really stand firm and what my real identity is instead of trying to hide from it.
Hmm.
So I think yeah, so that's kind of the journey of how I came to identify culturally.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and for me as well, being a first generation immigrant, two countries removed from Japan or my Japanese ancestry, it's always been very difficult to figure out my identity. And I feel like in large part, the way I identify has been formed by the ways that people interact with me. So with the last name Taguchi, people, looking at me might assume I'm Italian or something, but then the Japanese Americans would recognize that last name and sort of welcome me into the community. But my identity was something I had to discover for myself. It wasn't something I was all the way brought up in. Um, so it's very
Yeah.
interesting that you say that. You mentioned that you had grown up primarily with white friends and then were experiencing racism. Do you feel like that has shaped your views in any way? The way you view yourself and your reluctance to sort of embrace your Japanese American identity?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, like
Hmm.
vast majority of the white friends that I had in my life were not directly racist to me.
Hmm.
But I think I pretended that I could camouflage into like the white world
Right,
and
right.
they would notice. Um, just because I obviously, like the US is a white-centric country and white people have the most power, and I think it was a survival mechanism. So what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, how you think that influenced your identity, and how long it took for you to sort of embrace how you now identify.
Yeah, I think that being in, like I was like the only Asian girl in the white, crowd, um, allowed me to like really forget my cultural identity, which is what I was subconsciously seeking.
Hmm.
And it really didn't dawn on me until those big events happened, what I had been doing. And, it was a lot. I mean, it has a lot to do with how I was treated externally, but also internalized racism that actually began when I was born in Japan, because I was born in the late 70s, and just flipping through magazines when I was little, or like looking at commercials or TV, like all the standards of beauty were based on white people. And even nowadays, like 50% of like advertisements in Japan feature white people, as white people are considered more beautiful in Japan. And there's like a lot of post-war history and shame that goes into this kind of internalized racism that Japanese people carry. So I've
Hmm.
been holding on to that for a long time, and I still struggle with it sometimes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking so openly and candidly about your identity like that. I know it sounds like it's something that you've reflected on for a long time, I'm sure, to get to this point. Um, So next, I'm going to ask you more about the work you do. I also want to make a comment to the audience. I believe you can submit questions here on the Zoom platform. So if you have any questions that you want to ask as we proceed, please go ahead and submit those. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to get to some of those. So Yuki, as since we're talking about cultural appropriation and you work with traditional Japanese textiles and sort of are modernizing them in something of a unique way, do you have any thoughts about how the work you do relates to the heritage that you have, and perhaps how those without that heritage might engage or not engage in similar work? And that's a pretty broad way to phrase it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, generally, I since I started this business, I mean, I have encountered more instances where like non-Japanese people are participating and profiting from Japanese culture,
Hmm.
because people now are sending things to me a lot to like ask how to deal with it. And I
Hmm.
don't really always have an answer about that. But I grew up in New York City, like with kind of I don't know, my father once said to me when I was younger that I have a very American view of Japanese culture, because of having been raised in the US.
Hmm.
And like for example, in the 90s, like Calvin Klein ads were very like Japanese aesthetic, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And for sure, like that influenced how I view Japanese culture. It's just inevitable because of my upbringing. But that's kind of like how Japanese culture is an example of how it's interpreted in the US. And, it's troubling, but I think even now, like people who claim to be experts on Japanese culture or crafts are often not Japanese. And even in Japan, like people who, like, for example, there was a show about my hometown, which is famous for pottery, and like they chose a random Australian guy who lives in a nearby town to be the host about it, which is like really strange and confusing. But there's this reverence for the expertise of white people in America and in Japan. Um, so I I grew up kind of like, sometimes that dynamic really irritated me, but I also accepted it for a long time. I think as many of us did or do still do, or maybe
Hmm.
we have to. But nowadays I have more stronger feelings about where the limits should be. Like for me, I think, I mean, I really appreciate non-Japanese people who enjoy our culture and who maybe want to participate, but in many ways. But you know, the line where it starts to become a little offensive to me is when people identify as experts or they profit from using the culture in some way. So for me, that's kind of it's oversimplified maybe, but that's kind of where I draw the line. And, I think because of very long history and geopolitical dynamics, I think race does play a big part in what constitutes appropriation versus appreciation. And this is the part that is, I think most scary for everybody to talk about.
Right.
Because surely there are like many white people who enjoy other cultures without exploiting it. And that's probably the vast majority of people. But there are some people who take from other cultures for the sake of profit. And that sort of began in the colonial era. Like, for example, like how did Europe, which has the least amount of natural resources, like how did it become the most wealthy continent in the world? Well, look at the history. That kind of like pillaging and profiting from other people's resources began a long time ago. And to maybe for somebody like me or like other POCs, it's when we see especially white people profiting from POC cultures, it reminds us of that history. And yeah, I think that's where I draw the line. In terms of like participating in Japanese culture, like for example, like you come to Japan and maybe you want to try on a kimono. If you're supporting a Japanese business who do that for tourists, like I don't really, it doesn't bother me very much. Or maybe you're going to Obon festival and you want to wear yukata, and you have Japanese friends you're going with and they're wearing yukatas. I think that's perfectly fine for me. And also, like if you're going to a tea ceremony, or maybe you're studying tea ceremonies for whatever reason, or maybe you married a Japanese person, like I think it's okay to participate in the culture, but it's another thing to become like a YouTuber who's like benefiting from millions of views of like you explaining kitsuke and stuff like that, which I mean, it's great that you learned a lot, but it's like I think one should stop and think about one's place in terms of like privilege and history before you make the decision to profit or to claim to be an expert.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So since you're talking about, of course, the history of colonization, we definitely have to bear that in mind as we interact with different cultures. How do you feel the dynamics shift when we're not talking about white Europeans engaging in, for example, Japanese culture, but Japanese culture has become quite popular these days. So say there are other people of color engaging in Japanese culture in the same way. Do you feel that there's some nuance there, or what's your perspective then?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk about two examples. So one is my own business, because I have a kind of a pretty good number of people of Okinawan descent who follow me, and some of my customers are of Okinawan descent, and they identify as maybe Okinawan and Japanese. And maybe sometimes they only identify as Okinawan because Okinawa was an indigenous kingdom before it was annexed by Japan in the late 1800s. And it remains in a kind of a colonial state and has a very large US military presence because the government of Japan decided that they could throw all the military over there because those indigenous people are, they're not going to be as bothered as the mainlanders, or, it's very still unfair. And so I've been approached several times by people of Okinawan descent to ask if I make things from Okinawan textiles. Like they have a very long history of kasuri textiles, as well as bingata, which is a stencil dye method. It's really gorgeous and it has a rich history. And I really like struggled with this for a long time. And a friend that I made while I was in Okinawa, she's an indigenous rights activist, was taking a trip to the UN to go to the Indigenous Rights Peoples Forum earlier this year. So I approached her and I was like, I actually have a few pieces that are Okinawan textiles, but I was not planning to sell them. But what if I made products and I donated 20% of the profits to your upcoming trip? And she was like, okay, that's a great idea. And I thought this was like maybe an okay way for me to like answer some of the requests that I've had, as well as like kind of decrease my level of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
But after selling a few pieces, I decided this was not appropriate for me as a Japanese mainlander and also as an American citizen, for me to be making profit in any way from using Okinawan textiles, because I'm very conscious of the history and still the power dynamics between my country and the one that we annexed. And I for me, for my conscience, it's just important for me to follow that guideline for myself as well.
Mm.
Another example that I struggled with for a long time was a designer, an African American designer named Alyssa. She has an account called, or she has a brand called Jabella Fleur. Sorry, my pronunciation is not great, but it's, if you look on my, if you're interested to check later, I wrote about it in one of my blog posts. But Alyssa approached me and she asked how would it be if she used Japanese textiles or Japanese prints in her work. And she makes these like gorgeous, very nostalgic dresses from very beautiful prints that she curates, and a lot of it is upcycled material. And because she told me that she had I think she had bought some fabric in Japan on a prior trip and it had Japanese prints, and she didn't know if it was appropriate for her to use. And so we were doing this over Instagram chat initially. And my first reaction was like, I don't feel great about it. And, this is hard to admit, but I've written about it already. But my response to her at the time was like, well, how would you feel if Japanese people are using like African prints and selling those clothing? And as soon as I sent that message, I really regretted it, because she's African American, and her, and as like my gut sank. And she replied and she said, well, my ancestors were kidnapped from Africa and we were brought to America. So I don't have a direct connection to my heritage. So I don't know how I feel about other people using African prints at all. It's not the same. And, she's absolutely right. And I have I have the privilege of like knowing what my heritage is.
Mm.
And that really kind of put me in my place. But I still needed a few months to like really think about why my initial reaction wasn't like, no, don't do it. It was kind of like, well, I don't feel great about it, but I think maybe you can. And it took me a long time to figure out why I felt like really so much ambivalence about it. Her, as her being an African American maker. And the reason is because as a Japanese person and as an American, I benefit greatly from a system that was built on the backs of like kidnapped slaves from Africa. The country that of America is the way it is because those people who were kidnapped provided the labor for for America to become a wealthy country from the beginning. And as a Japanese person, I have also benefited from this system in that after World War II, the US government was interested in creating an example of a successful capitalist nation in Asia to kind of counter the growing power of China. and the Soviet Union at the time, and I benefit, like now I think Japan is the third largest economy, but that's another example of how I benefited from this system that was based on slavery and racism.
Mm.
So, as a person who comes from such privilege, like what is it that I can share, or my culture can share, to uplift the people who have, against their will, put us in this privileged position.
Mm.
And I think that's why, like, when I really thought about it for a long time, I thought, this is my personal opinion, but
Mm.
what we need to do is uplift people like Alyssa. And my personal opinion is that if she can benefit economically from using Japanese prints in her work, then she should. And that's kind of the conclusion I came to. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a real journey thinking about these
Yeah.
things.
No, and thank you so much for being, so vulnerable and walking us through this journey and your own personal growth. I feel like in the present day and age, we're under so much pressure to act as if we've always been as aware and thoughtful as we are in the moment throughout our lives. But in reality, most of us weren't talking about these things as children. We weren't raised on these topics, and we've come a long way in our understanding. So thank you for modeling what that process can look like. Um, so I heard a couple interesting things as you were speaking. So if I may paraphrase, it sounds like even though you yourself grew up as a minority, experiencing racism, experiencing kind of your place in the systemic society that is the United States, you still had to be mindful of your relative privilege and even the broader historical privilege of your place and how you interact with other people in the system. And so the way that you decide when you feel that your culture is being appropriated isn't really just about how it's being used, but who is using it. So that was very, very interesting to me. The other theme that I sort of heard is, you keep coming back to this point of who is profiting off of the work that's done, whether that's monetary profit or just social credibility, followers on YouTube, or just this expert status. And so that makes me wonder, like, how different would it be if our society was not so based in capitalism? For example, the work you wanted to do using traditional Okinawan textiles at the request of Okinawan individuals to support Okinawan individuals, and you still felt like, because you have to pay the bills, you couldn't operate in any way because you were still forced to draw a profit from this work. If we had such a system where you were free to just create and give away without having to pull profit, would that change how you could engage with these other cultures?
Wow, that's a really interesting question that I've never thought about. Because to suppose that we don't live in a capitalistic world is dreamy, but I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah. It may
how.
not happen. We're just trying to tease out the philosophical, where exactly is ooh, that's not okay versus, I guess, maybe that would be okay. Right?
And the current history that we have would be same in this parallel world.
I mean, you may interpret it as you like.
Okay. I think that one should never deny what happened in history, and
Mhm.
we should always dig deeper to find out the truth, because we're being taught in schools and what the governments want
Mhm.
us to really understand and to think about may not always be readily available in, like, school education.
Okay.
I didn't learn about a lot of stuff until I decided to educate myself, and I think people probably have this experience too. But
So if we have the same historical context, just from here forward, you receive a subsidy, a check in the mail for artists to do your craft, and it covers the bills.
I see. Yeah, there are examples of that I've come across, where, like, maybe artists who aren't really necessarily making a profit from, or making a living from their art, are utilizing Japanese culture. I still don't feel great about it. I think that,
Mm.
I do think that you should think about racial dynamics in history, always, even if it doesn't include monetary transaction. Because for many people whose culture you might be borrowing from, it might just feel very yucky to us because immediately it brings to mind the dynamics that we've have had. So you can't, it's impossible to ignore it, and you should not ignore it if you're participating in any way with another culture. Is my opinion. And just to go back to like the wearing kimonos example, I don't feel particularly offended by it if you're going to participate. But there are people who have had much more trauma than I have, that related to their Japanese heritage. Like maybe they've had, incarceration, and that intergenerational trauma has really impacted them. And seeing any American or white person wearing a kimono is like really triggering. Some people do feel that way. So I think that you should be mindful of that as well. And no, you can't please everybody all the time, but I think people should try to be as sensitive as possible to like consider other people's experiences regarding their own culture.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. That's certainly a sentiment that comes up a lot in JCL as we hear about the histories where, grandparents were locked up in camps for being too Japanese, or as it was perceived at the time, not American enough. And now to see other Americans freely embracing this culture and walking down the street unmolested, it's very different and a little jarring. So yeah, it's certainly an important culture, and I think it's something that we wrestle with differently, as you mentioned before, when you're in Japan and your host family is embracing you and telling you to try this on and walk down the street, versus in the United States, you may have a different reception.
For sure.
So on that topic, you've mentioned that your clothing is intended to be a little more versatile in terms of its uses. It's using the traditional kimono and yukata textiles, but you're kind of readapting them into more of a contemporary form. Do you feel like that affects, I mean, you already said you don't have that strong of an opinion when, let's say, white people wear kimono and yukata, but do you feel like there's more flexibility in who can use your clothing than the traditional outfits?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like my intention is to use the textiles to make clothing that anybody could wear. And again, this is my personal opinion, but I mean, from my perspective, I think that everybody should be able to wear it, because I'm not selling the kind of offensive image of the kimono as it has been perceived, especially like in post World War II US. It's not sexualized at all from the way that I use the textiles, or objectified in any yucky way, I think. And so I think, my intention is to make it available for everybody, but also to remind people, or just to make it obvious to people, that when you're wearing my clothing, you're not wearing a kimono, you're wearing upcycled textile of the kimono. And I honor people's appreciation for Japanese textiles. I think there's no harm in appreciating Japanese textiles. And I think that my upcycled clothing gives a way for people to enjoy it, and not let it not be exploitative.
Thanks for that. It's a very interesting point. So now I have a question that's, again, getting a little philosophical and wishful thinking, but it's something that I hope to ask to each of the participants in our discussion series to get an idea of where the views interact. So as we consider, every conversation, every social activity we take a part in, we're starting to form what our future will look like. And as we try to, do you feel like there is a way that we can move forward into respectful cultural exchange? And what I mean by that is, if we if we focus too much on the generational trauma and the who can do this, who can do that, we may wind up in the situation where people feel boxed in. Like, I'm only able to do the things of my culture. I shouldn't engage with that culture. No cultural exchange, no cultural appropriation, but also no cultural appreciation. So what I worry about is, in such a world, the only shared common culture that everyone's entitled to use is the dominant white Eurocentric culture that's sort of been imposed on everyone. And I don't feel like, in the grand scheme of things, that's my idea of the perfect world, in which, we can wear as much European clothing as we like, but we're not allowed to engage with different cultures. So I wonder if you have any perspective on that, or how it could be narrower to your perspectives and how they fit into that.
Well, I think if you're living in the US or in Europe, like if you want to engage with Japanese culture, first of all, I think I would advise that if you want to go learn about Japanese culture, that you're going to go learn it from a Japanese person. And this goes for any, engaging in any culture. I think that if you want to learn about tea ceremony, make sure you go find a Japanese or Japanese American or, Japanese heritage teacher, instead of like, kind of giving economic benefit to non-Japanese people who are representing. And I don't want people to be so scared of appropriation that they just don't engage at all with Japanese culture. That's not, personally, that's not my goal. Like, my goal is to like, initially I really felt when I began the business that there was a big misconception of what kimono is. So one of my goals was to kind of draw the people in who have maybe images that may be offensive to somebody like me, because they may think that they like kimonos, but they have a very skewed perception of it. Like, one of my goals is to draw those people in, sort of re-educate them, and kind of let them come out of the experience like with a better way to appreciate, rather than like hold on to these kind of like appropriative, objectified kind of images.
Mhm.
So, I think it's important to learn about other cultures. And I don't discourage it at all. Like, it would be great if people went to learn taiko, or they went to Obon festival, or they want to, learn how to put on a kimono so that they can go to a tea ceremony class. As long as you're not like out there in like regular daily life, like wearing kimono and like, inappropriately. I don't think that there's any harm in it. But I do think that, once you start getting very deep into it, then you might want to you might want to remember your humility when you talk about it as an expert, or you might want to make sure of where you draw the line morally, in terms of like how you talk about another culture.
Mhm. No, thank you. So
Yeah.
we've gotten a couple of questions, and I'll give you a chance to look over and see if there's anything you would feel comfortable answering.
Yeah, let
Um,
me go through them. Give me a
yeah,
second.
I can also go ahead, for anyone who's joining us on Zoom, depending how you got here, you may or may not have registered for the event series, or you may have just clicked the Zoom link and come in today. So I'm going to share, I think you all can see here in the chat. But if you go to tcjacl.org, that's the Twin Cities JCL's website, we have an event page that lays out this entire series that includes a description of Yuki and then the other individuals that we're going to be interviewing. And so if you register for the series with the form that's on there, we'll send you the link for each, our events are spaced about 2 weeks apart. So we'll send you the Zoom link each time to make sure you don't miss anything. But we'll continue to share on social media as well. So if that's easier for you, make sure that you follow Twin Cities JCL and Made by Yuki on social media.
Okay, so I've looked through some of the questions that have
Mhm.
been submitted. So let's see. where are the Japanese experts? Maybe. Is it okay if I just read the question out loud
Yeah,
before I
sure.
answer?
Or I can read it if you'd prefer, however.
So maybe the first question, can you read that?
Okay. So someone wrote, so I'm wondering where are the Japanese experts? Maybe I'm missing out because I don't speak or read Japanese. Or are these arts dying out and the experts aren't around anymore? So I think that goes to the point you were making about seeking out Japanese individuals to be labeled as experts. So what if we can't find them?
This is a very valid question. I understand this is a very big problem in the world. For example, recently I was approached by a white American author who was writing an article for Lonely Planet. And she wanted to interview me about Okinawa because I lived there for 5 years. And first of all, I was like, well, I'm not Okinawan, so I don't, that layer I feel uncomfortable with. And second of all, is there compensation? And she was like, no, but obviously she's getting paid to do this, right? And who are the people at Lonely Planet who is selecting a white American person living in Japan to write about Japan instead of many, Japanese Americans or Japanese people who speak English fluently who live in Japan to write these articles? This is a systemic problem. The Japanese experts are out there, but they may not be getting the same platform that
Mhm.
their white colleagues are getting.
Mhm.
So, I think that to correct this problem, we should write to these publishers, and we should also uplift the Japanese experts when they're there
Mhm.
because they're not getting the platforms that they deserve because of their race. And we need to all be aware of that and try to change this dynamic.
Mhm. I think that's a great point. I know that's something that comes up a lot in the work I do. So for those who don't know me, my background is in civil engineering, and I've just recently graduated from graduate school. And so I go to a lot of academic conferences where we're presenting our research. We invite speakers who are eminent in the field to share the work that they're doing. And there's been a big push recently to try to broaden the diversity of who's speaking. And one of the responses that we get sometime is saying, well, we invite the most established person on this topic, and it's not our fault that we can't find someone of different identities. We're only finding old white men for the most part. And to the points that Yuki was making, we've got many people out there working in the scientific and engineering world, and a lot of times they just haven't been given the same visibility as the established old white man who gets all the awards. So yeah, we also feel like the responsibility is sort of on us to go out and look for these people. They're publishing work somewhere out there. Their work is right. So we just have to make that extra step to find them.
Exactly. Yeah, would you mind reading question two?
Sure. So question two. What, if anything, do you say when a non-Japanese American person presents themselves as an expert in some aspect of Japanese culture in casual conversation? I come across this often. Even if the person is correct or happens to know more than me, it irritates me. I also don't want to be a wet blanket if someone is just excited about some aspect of Japanese culture. Okay, so a little bit of nuance there. How do we stay firm to our principles, but not just crippling the conversation?
Yeah, I have a feeling this is written by a Japanese American person and perhaps a woman, maybe. But as a Asian woman uh, living in America, this happened a lot. I think that there is inequality between the gender and also this racial. And yeah, it's really irritating, and it's it's really like maddening sometimes. And but I think again, this is kind of the status quo where the people who are accepted as experts are usually white and male. And I think that perhaps some people who are not aware of this dynamic, who fit that description, are just kind of used to being respected or expected to be expert, and they may have just learned this dynamic. So I don't know. I don't really have an exact advice about how to respond, but I think that if you feel angry about it, I think that, you shouldn't ignore your feeling, because there's a reason why why it irritates you and me and a lot of other people out there, but as also Japanese people culturally, and I think Asian, like, societies in general, we're non-confrontational, which sometimes works in our favor, but in places like America, it does not. It has not been really beneficial to suppress our anger in a place like America. And I think that, you may use some tact to have a conversation with this person, maybe privately, not to embarrass them out, in the public, but just to be like, hey, like, maybe you know more than me, but the way that you were talking about it makes me feel, whatever. Be honest, and maybe if this person is a friend or they're a good, conscious person, this might be like a good, maybe this might be a good experience for them to get some perspective.
Yeah, and if I may, I can also offer a different perspective that I've encountered before in the Japanese American community, where some people were noticing that they reacted very strongly to things like this. It bothered them to see individuals wearing kimono or speaking Japanese fluently when they themselves didn't have that. And they had to sort of wrestle with their feelings and recognize that that came from the multi-generational trauma of the incarceration experience, that their parents were under pressure, their parents and grandparents were under pressure to Americanize, to not teach Japanese, to not use Japanese names, and to avoid public Japanese culture. And so they were realizing that a lot of the feelings that they had against individuals were really more against the system and the context that brought us to this point, which of course we can't do much to change the past, so it's not necessarily a solution, but it was one more thing to be mindful of that they found helpful.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because especially people who came out of the incarceration, like I think a lot of families decided to not teach their children Japanese, and that's like must be very painful for somebody in that position to encounter other people who may have been able to participate in Japanese culture without any harm being done to them. But I think that, if this is a very good friend, it might be worth like just sitting down and just sharing what the experience feels like to them. I don't think there's any harm in talking about it. I mean, in fact, this is why we started this series, is because, this is such a hot topic, but people don't really delve into it very deeply, because people can take things the wrong way. And I think there will be people who take this talk the wrong way, and probably all the other speakers as well. But, we need to start talking about it to sort of, get beyond like it being too triggering. We should kind of come to like mutual understanding between all the communities in order to move forward in a way that is more sensitive and equal.
Absolutely.
Okay. So would you read number 3?
All right. So the third question, how do you think about different cultures influencing each other over time? For instance, elements of the Japanese Mingei movement were influenced by Korean wares, as the Mingei founder Soetsu Yanagi lived in Korea for some time. How do you decide what's appropriated or appreciated, or belongs to one culture or another, especially when history is so complex? So again, getting at that interesting dynamic of, the same person can be marginalized and discriminated against in one place and be part of the dominant colonizing culture in another.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm gonna be honest up front and say that I don't know a lot about the Mingei movement, nor about the founder or when he lived in Korea. I think the timing might be a little bit important. I think if it was during like Japanese imperial colonial era that he lived in Korea, where thousands and thousands of Korean people were being butchered by the Japanese military, and then he decided to take some elements of Korean culture and bring it back to Japan to start this movement, then I would find it very offensive. But if you're talking about the long history of migration, you know, actually Japanese people are kind of like Americans in that we came from different parts of East Asia, and we took over these lands. They originally belonged to the Ainu, which are the indigenous people here. So like I'm probably my heritage is like from, comes from like China and Korea and those people. So, if you're talking about the long-term migration that has happened over thousands of years, like I think that's really hard to parse out. But I think there are very defining periods of time, like the colonial expansion of Japan. I think it was late 1800s, early 1900s, before World War I. Then we can definitely draw some conclusions about that. But these are also personal interpretations. I think this kind of, just to go back on my point earlier, like just as I would not profit from using Okinawan textiles, I feel the same way, especially I feel very strongly, especially regarding cultures that we colonized, pre-World War One, because the Japanese military were really ruthless. I don't. It's not my business to be profiting from like Filipino or Korean or Chinese culture. It's just, it'd be so disrespectful, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. These are very big topics to discuss, and I'm sure there's a lot of history to delve into. So I hope that helped to answer some of the question. And thank you, Yuki, so much for answering all of the questions. I know it's difficult when we don't have time to prepare to speak in a nuanced way when we don't know all the context, but I think you modeled a beautiful way to do that and sort of leave room for not knowing everything and still contributing a valuable perspective to this discussion. We received one more comment. That was not a question, but someone was appreciative of how you honor the original textile maker by upcycling the damaged kimonos and giving their art new life. And they themselves have a damaged kimono that their aunt purchased in Japan, and they're hoping to make it into a new garment to give it new life.
It's wonderful.
So I think we're about at the end of our time here. I want to be respectful of everyone's Saturday evening, or if you're in a different time zone, maybe Sunday morning. But here's some information in the chat. So this is the first part of a discussion series. The next part will be on Saturday, August 26th at 8 p.m. US Eastern Time. And Yuki has graciously volunteered to interview our next guest, who's going to be Emi Ito Gates of Little Koto's Closet, which if you haven't seen their work on Instagram, I highly recommend it. And so if you want to make sure you get Zoom links to all of our discussions, please go ahead and register. I put the link in the chat there from the Twin Cities JCL website. If you have questions ahead of time that you want to submit to the speakers and allow them to prepare for, please send those at advocacy@tcjcl.org. Or again, you'll be able to submit questions on Zoom like you did today. And please follow Yuki's wonderful work on Instagram. Oh, and there's also a question about recordings. So recordings are going to be available at the discretion of the guest. So Yuki will let us know how they feel this conversation went and if they want it to be available as a recording, but then we will share the recordings out with everyone who registered. And I believe we would also try to put it on Facebook and YouTube so people can find it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this conversation. I hope you can join with the following speakers. There's going to be 6 speakers total in this series. So make sure you sign up, and we'll send you the links for the next events. And yeah, thank you for being part of this new thing we're trying to do. And hopefully you can help us spread the word about our series.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.